a new phase in the impeachment inquiry starts this week.
That's right. The House Intelligence Committee is expected to deliver its report to the House Judiciary Committee, and then that panel will hold its own public hearings, and it will begin the process of drafting and debating articles of impeachment against President Trump. Now, last night, the White House announced it will not participate in a hearing on Wednesday. All of this is happening as the president gets ready to leave town. He's on his way to London this morning for NATO meetings.
NPR's White House correspondent Tamara Keith will be traveling with the president. Hi, Tam.
Hello.
All right, so as David said, the Judiciary Committee takes over the inquiry from here. They have been talking about it. Congresswoman Val Demings, a Democrat, she's on that committee, and here's what she said yesterday.
I think our main focus right now is to have the president and his counsel, who you know are given the same privileges as President Nixon and President Clinton had, to participate and engage in this impeachment process.
All right, so what she's saying there is the White House was invited to this public hearing on Wednesday, but the White House turned it down. They said, no, we won't be there. Why?
Well, the reason is that they say that they don't know who the witnesses are going to be, and it's not clear to the White House. This is from a letter from Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, to the committee. He says it's not clear whether this is going to be a fair process. What we know is that Jerry Nadler, the committee chairman, asked the White House or the president to participate, but the president's going to be out of town. And we know that some scholars are supposed to testify about the impeachment process and precedent. Cipollone in his letter says an invitation to an academic discussion with law professors does not begin to provide the president with any semblance of a fair process. But what is notable here is that he is not ruling out participation in future hearings. He's only at this point saying that the White House won't participate in this one hearing. He says if the White House is serious about conducting a fair process going forward, that the president may consider participating in future Judiciary Committee proceedings.
So this is a line that the White House has used throughout this process, which is the process itself is unfair to us. Let's talk about the hearing this week on Wednesday. What should we be expecting?
I think for this hearing, it is going to be an academic discussion. The committee, the way the rules are set up, the Democrats on the committee will be able to invite 3 witnesses, and the Republicans on the committee will be able to invite 1 witness. And it is likely to be an academic debate about impeachment. This is really sort of the hors d'oeuvre to what will be a longer process, maybe only a week longer, but where they really get into the substance of the allegations against President Trump.
The hors d'oeuvre. Interesting. All right. Tam, as you mentioned, the president has said, look, I'm going to be in London on Wednesday meeting with NATO leaders. You guys knew that. I can't be there. Is this a chance for President Trump to kind of get a break from impeachment?
Yeah, and the White House counsel in his letter said that implied, well, maybe you guys scheduled this on purpose while the president is out of the country. There had been this tradition of politics end at the water's edge, but that is painfully out of date at this point. During his impeachment, President Clinton traveled overseas a number of times, and there was one particular trip in the Middle East where he was having this press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, trying to talk about the peace process, and instead every single question was about impeachment, most of them asking whether he was going to resign. And of course, he said he wasn't going to resign. Netanyahu got so frustrated at one point, he begged them to ask about anything else.
So we will see if President Trump gets any questions on this trip. We expect he probably will. NPR's Tamara Keith. Thanks,
Tim. He will. Thanks.
The world is moving toward a point of no return on climate change.
Yeah, that was the stark warning from the United Nations Secretary General yesterday.
We simply have to stop digging and drilling and take advantage of the vast possibilities offered by renewable energy and nature-based solutions.
Antonio Guterres spoke on the eve of today's global climate conference in Madrid. The COP25 summit brings together nearly 200 nations to talk about ways to avert a climate catastrophe. But while American diplomats are going to be at the table, the Trump administration has announced that the United States will exit the Paris Climate Pact by next year. So what can be accomplished here without buy-in from the world's largest economy?
Reporter Guy Hedgecoe is in Madrid covering the conference. Hi, Guy.
Hi there.
So this conference got off to sort of a weird and dramatic start. What happened?
Well, the event was due to be held in Santiago de Chile originally, but there's been a tremendous amount of social unrest in Chile over the last few weeks. So that country's government pulled out of hosting the climate conference about a month ago, so really not very long before it was due to start. And that was potentially a disastrous decision. But Spain immediately stepped in and offered to host it instead. And so Madrid has been organizing this major international event pretty much in record time. Now, this all took place just as the US was formalizing the beginning of that withdrawal you mentioned from the Paris Agreement on climate change. And incidentally, the Spanish Environment Minister, Teresa Ribera, has said that her country's offer to host the conference was a demonstration of multilateralism to counter the US withdrawal.
Interesting. What do the people attending want to come out of this meeting concretely?
Well, this is very much, following up on the Paris Agreement from 4 years ago, which laid out objectives for cutting emissions, trying to keep global temperature increases below 2 degrees centigrade. It's unlikely that we're going to see one major breakthrough at this conference, I think. And that's in great part because this is seen as a kind of stepping stone event ahead of next year's conference, which is where countries are due to give new, updated and concrete commitments to cutting emissions. And this event is more about finding out what can be achieved next year in terms of those new promises. Now, that makes it sound all rather woolly and a bit vague. Yeah. But there is a feeling that, finding out what can be achieved at this conference is going to be pretty key. So that's going to be quite important.
And Guy, what does the American withdrawal from the Paris Accord mean for the goals of this conference? Do they have to be less ambitious, for example?
Well, it's a major blow for the other countries taking part that, the world's largest economy isn't, part of the Paris Agreement anymore. That's a major blow. But I think they've digested that and they feel that if they can get enough momentum going on these talks, if they can get new objectives together, perhaps, just perhaps, in the next few months or possibly next year, they can persuade the US to sort of come back on board and join in on commitments to reducing carbon emissions.
Okay, so some attempts to kind of get the US to at least agree to something, yeah?
Exactly. That's the idea.
Guy Hedgecoe, reporter in Madrid. Guy, thanks so much.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure.
This morning in London, there's a vigil for two people in their 20s who were stabbed to death by an Islamist terrorist on Friday.
Yeah, they were helping to organize this conference through Cambridge University. The subject was prisoner rehabilitation. Police say the perpetrator began his attack at that conference. But what made this incident stand out was not only the victims or the perpetrator, but those who captured him. They were civilians armed with a narwhal tusk, a fire extinguisher, really whatever they could find.
NPR's Frank Langfitt is in London. He's been following this story. Hey there, Frank.
Hey, good morning, Noelle.
Okay, so David summed up a bit of it there, but if you would, just remind me, what happened Friday?
Yeah, well, the man who was behind this, the terrorist, was a guy named Usman Khan, who actually had served time for terror charges in the past. And he appears to have been attending the conference and had some relationship with the program. In the afternoon, he started attacking people with a knife. And some of the people at the conference, so people who were in the building, actually fought back. Particularly one person grabbed a narwhal tusk off the wall and began stabbing him. And eventually they chased the terrorist out onto the street, onto London Bridge. There was another man with a fire extinguisher spraying the terrorist with his fire extinguisher. They cornered him, they got him on the ground, and then police came in and shot him.
Just absolutely extraordinary. How are normal people in the UK responding to all this?
I think that there is pride to see civilians do this. I think, if I can keep track, Noelle, this is the fifth terror attack in London in the last several years.
Wow.
And with all of what's been happening with Brexit and the country tearing itself apart, there hasn't been a lot to celebrate. Mayor Sadiq Khan referred to these civilians as the best of us. Now, one of the guy who grabbed the narwhal tusk was a Polish chef. He actually ended up getting stabbed 5 times and still kept going after the terrorist. And again, with Brexit and issues of immigration, this makes this an even more interesting story because some people who voted for Brexit want the immigrants, people like this Polish chef, to leave, and yet he ends up Poland says they're going to give him the highest medal that they have for what he's done. Now, this is also a very complex story. One of the people who subdued the attacker reportedly actually was a convict himself who had been serving time for murder and was out on a one-day release. So really, with each day, this becomes a more complex and interesting story.
And what do we know about the victims here, Frank?
Young, promising people, 2 Cambridge University graduates in their 20s who had studied criminology. One was named Saskia Jones. She was volunteering at this conference. Jack Merritt, another victim, he was helping coordinate it. And today, the headline in the Cambridge News said they tried to make the world a better place.
Britain will hold national elections in 10 days. Has this attack become part of the campaigning around those elections?
Immediately, it became a political football. Yeah, because Khan had been released early on a terror conviction. Prime Minister Boris Johnson is blaming the Labour Party, the opposition Labour Party, because these were policies under Labour. But the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson, has been in for 10 years. So the question is, why didn't they do something about it? And family members of the victims say they do not want these deaths politicized.
NPR's Frank Langfitt in London. Frank, thanks so much.
You're very welcome, Noel.
Dueling reports on impeachment are taking center stage on Capitol Hill.
That's right. The House Intelligence Committee, led by Democrats, is expected to release a report today that says President Trump did commit impeachable acts when he pressured Ukraine to investigate his political rival. But last night, Republican lawmakers released a counter report that defends the president. And now this week, the House Judiciary Committee will take over the impeachment inquiry.
Okay, a lot of reading here for NPR political reporter Tim Mack, part of our team covering the impeachment inquiry. Hey there, Tim.
Hey there.
Okay, so you've read the rebuttal from House Republicans defending the president. What stands out to you?
Well, the report features a lot of now well-known defenses of the president. Republicans are essentially arguing the president has done nothing wrong. And they say that there was no pressure on the Ukrainian government. They contend that any requests the president made for investigations into the Bidens or Burisma had nothing to do with benefiting him personally. The Republican report says that the president has a, quote, deep-seated, genuine, and reasonable skepticism of Ukraine due to its history of pervasive corruption, and that any concerns he might have had about, say, Hunter Biden's role with Burisma are totally valid. The protests from Trump administration officials, the report says, are simply from unelected bureaucrats who don't understand the president's, quote, outside of the beltway thinking.
Okay, so that's one narrative. A different narrative we're expecting from the Democratic majority, and lawmakers got to preview the report drafted by them already, right?
That's right. Well, starting at around 6 p.m. last night, members of the Intelligence Committee were able to review that draft report. They're expected to hold a vote on the report this evening and then to approve, probably in a party line fashion, the report to be sent formally to the House Judiciary Committee. Now, Congressman Adam Schiff said in a statement last evening responding to the Republican report that there's voluminous evidence that the president has used the power of his office to pressure Ukraine into investigating his political rival, and that, quote, in so doing, the president undermined our national security and the integrity of our elections. We're not really expecting the report to contain a ton of new information. I mean, the facts on which the report is based, they're all derived from public testimony, hours of hearings we can all review, and closed-door interviews with transcripts that have since been released. But we are expecting the facts to be packaged in a new way, for Democrats to present the facts they've learned in an organized fashion that makes their case, that the president's misconduct can be considered impeachable.
So you mentioned hours of hearings. We're going to get more hours on Wednesday when the House Judiciary Committee holds its first hearing. It sounds like this hearing, at least, is going to be pretty different based on the witness list that we've gotten.
Right. It's not going to be fact witnesses. They're legal scholars from Harvard and Stanford and the University of North Carolina. And there's also John Turley of George Washington University. He's a witness requested by Republicans. Here he is on Morning Edition last month to kind of give a sense of where he stands.
I think if they use a bribery article of impeachment, it will undermine them dramatically from a constitutional standpoint. You will follow tragedy with farce, in my view.
So polling suggests that 70% of Americans believe the president has committed some sort of misconduct, but just about 50% or so believe that he should be impeached and removed. So Democrats are trying to make it clear what exactly is an impeachable act and what rises to that level.
Okay, so we've got some experts coming, professors at a hearing Wednesday. We've got these two reports, dueling reports. What exactly happens next in the process?
Well, so there are a lot of unknowns as to the exact timing and how many hearings will happen. The Judiciary Committee could choose to have a number of hearings, then one on the language of potential articles of impeachment. And if the Judiciary Committee approves those articles, it would then head to the full House for a vote.
NPR's Tim Mak. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thanks a lot.
All right, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is meeting today in London.
That's right. President Trump is there. He's set to meet with leaders, including France's President Emmanuel Macron. This meeting is happening at an interesting time. Yesterday, the Trump administration threatened to put very high tariffs on some French goods like champagne and cheese. Now, that was a response to a French plan to tax U.S. tech companies. Here's President Trump this morning in London.
France is not doing well economically at all. They're starting to tax other people's products, so therefore we go and tax them.
All right, NPR's Eleanor Beardsley has been reporting on the Macron-Trump relationship and all that it's been through, a lot of ups and downs. She's in Paris. Hi, Eleanor.
Hi, David.
So remind us how Macron and Trump got along at first. Things were pretty nice, right?
Yeah, they were really nice. You know, Macron took a different strategy from other European leaders who some of them looked disdainfully at Trump. He thought he could be his friend. He could be inclusive in this way, you know, get through to him. Remember when he brought Trump to Paris for Bastille Day? He wooed him with that big military parade and he impressed him with his great knowledge. Well, Macron thought he could convince Trump to keep America engaged with the international community by doing that.
So when did things start to fall apart?
Well, things started to fall apart when Trump just pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, and despite the French president telling him it would be smart for the U.S. to stay in, and then the U.S. left the Iran deal, which the Europeans had worked hard for and stood by. Now there's more huge tariffs on an ally. France has already denounced this. And, you know, Macron is actually changing his style. He's decided to get tough. No more Mr. Nice Guy. And we got a preview of this with his recent interview in The Economist magazine where he was critical of the U.S., and he said that NATO was brain dead. And I spoke with Christian Macarion, who's the deputy editor of L'Express magazine, and he says Donald Trump is actually at the heart of Macron's transformation. Here's what he told me.
Macron has clearly decided to be more offensive because he has realized there was no benefit to be the nice guy. And Trump, in a way, has won, because he has forced Macron to reveal another face and to change his strategy. Being the kind guy, the nice boy, is absolutely inefficient in the current world.
Okay, so in the words of that editor, no more nice boy for Macron.
Yeah.
How will this new strategy play out as these two leaders meet today?
Well, you know, Macron's likely to be pretty angry about the tariffs, but as far as his NATO comments, he stands by them because he says the U.S. pulled out of northern Syria, didn't let its allies know, and now, you know, Turkey, a NATO member, is bombing the Kurds who are our allies fighting ISIS. He says it shows NATO has no coherent strategy and clearly needs redefining.
All right, NPR's Eleanor Beardsley. Thanks so much, Eleanor.
Thank you, David.
Okay, very important warning to people listening here. This next topic refers to alleged acts of violence, including sexual assault. You might not want to listen if you are with children.
Virginia Giuffre is one of Jeffrey Epstein's alleged victims. She gave an interview to the BBC show Panorama. That interview aired last night, and in it, she says Epstein brought her to the UK when she was 17 years old and forced her to have sex with Prince Andrew. Now, Prince Andrew emphatically denies the allegations. He said he has, quote, no recollection of ever meeting Giuffre. The BBC asked the prince about her allegations last month, and he said, quote, it never happened. And then here's how Giuffre responded to that.
I'm calling BS on this because that's what it is. He knows what happened. I know what happened. And there's only one of us telling the truth. And I know that's me.
Okay, and just a warning again, this conversation could disturb some listeners. I want to turn to Richard Fitzwilliams. He's a royals commentator in the UK, joining us from London. Hi, Richard.
Good morning.
So what did you take away from this BBC interview?
Well, I think that the program was extremely powerful because it had a documentary feel to it. And Virginia Giuffre, she was deeply emotional. She was someone, I think, to whom you could relate, given the fact that she'd had an abusive childhood, and also, of course, is one of the alleged victims of a monstrous paedophile. And it was very powerful, and also I took away from it, and I would emphasize that it was intercut with extracts from Prince Andrew's recent interview, where he was interviewed by Emily Maitlis at Buckingham Palace. Now, this was a stupefyingly imbecilic car crash of an interview. I can only say it's of Krakatoan proportions. It's entered our general election debate. It's made him defensive. It's forced him to step down from royal duties. If Buckingham Palace thought that him stepping down as a royal would draw some sort of a line over the allegations, they are most certainly mistaken, because we now learn that 5 of Epstein's accusers, have demanded Andrew give evidence in their claims against him, and their lawyers are poised to issue subpoenas if he visits the United States. I mean, this was toxic.
Has there been any response from the royal family since this interview aired?
The Buckingham Palace line is that Andrew, under no circumstances, had any sexual relations with Virginia Giuffre. Indeed, he denies he can even remember her. But the issue of a photograph of them together taken in 2001, I can only say that the evidence Panorama produced that it was genuine seemed credible to me. Andrew appeared to imply that it might have been doctored and it was a photograph of a photograph of a photograph. I can only say that only 6% of those, this was a YouGov poll in the Times, who believed, 6% of the population believed Andrew, 43% didn't know, 51% did not. The facts are that it really has been a disastrous period for the royal family, because also it has shone a light on his trade role for business deals of his own. Now, this too has been, I think, very, very difficult.
Richard Fitzwilliams is a royals commentator. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The impeachment inquiry will be in new hands today.
That's right. Things are moving now to the House Judiciary Committee, which will hold its first hearing today. There are going to be 4 legal scholars testifying there about the constitutional basis for impeachment. This comes after Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee released their report making the case for President Trump's impeachment yesterday. Included in that report, there are records showing the suspicious phone calls between Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and the White House that seem to coincide with key events in the Ukraine scandal.
For more, we've got White House reporter Aisha Roscoe with us this morning. Hi, Aisha.
Good morning.
All right, let's start with today's hearing. So we mentioned legal scholars. Who's going to testify? What kind of questions are they going to get?
So you have three law professors picked by Democrats: Noah Feldman, Pamela Karlan, Michael Gerhardt. Then for the Republicans, you have Jonathan Turley. What these experts are supposed to be talking about is the constitutional basis for impeachment. A lot will be about whether Trump's actions, as outlined in the Democrats' report, rises to the level of impeachment. These hearings will have a similar format to the other public impeachment hearings. There'll be these opening statements from the chairman and ranking member, and then both sides will have 45 minutes where counsel will be able to question the witnesses before it's opened up to the whole committee.
I want to ask about the House Intelligence Committee report. This is what has now triggered the House Judiciary Committee to take over. What is important for us to understand in this document?
So this is an extensive 300-page report based on evidence gathered so far, interviews with current and former officials, and other documents and records. Intel Chairman Adam Schiff said that the findings show abundant evidence that Trump pressured Ukraine for political favors in exchange for military aid and a White House visit. Here's Schiff in an interview with Morning Edition's Steve Inskeep yesterday.
I think our report shows abundant evidence, really overwhelming evidence, that the president used the power of his office, conditioned official acts, a White House meeting, and hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid to a nation at war in exchange for things of value to him, political favors, 2 investigations he thought would help his reelection campaign.
So this was the Democrats really laying out their case for impeachment against the president. Another part of the report that struck me, Aisha, I'm going to quote here: "The damage to our system of checks and balances and to the balance of power within our 3 branches of government will be long-lasting and potentially irrevocable." Adam Schiff and the rest of the committee here clearly framing this as a dangerous precedent, right? Looking into the future.
Yeah, it gets to this larger point that Democrats seem to be making, is that presumably if you don't move ahead and take action on this by Congress, then other presidents in the future may feel unrestrained and take similar actions. And basically you would be kind of losing a check that Congress has on the presidency.
Lastly, can you tell us of these phone records that were included in the report?
Yeah, so this report reveals these phone records, phone calls between Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and Devin Nunes, who's the top Republican on the Intel Committee and a Trump ally. But it also has these calls between Giuliani and a White House number at some points in the Ukraine scandal, such as when the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, was being told to come back to Washington. So there are a lot of questions about coordination between the White House and Giuliani.
All right, NPR White House reporter Aisha Roscoe for us this morning. Aisha, thank you as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, there's a showdown at the NATO meetings in London between one key member, Turkey, and the rest of the alliance.
That's right. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is threatening to hold up NATO's work unless the alliance labels the Kurdish fighters in Syria as terrorists. Let's remember, these are the same fighters who have sided with the United States in the war against ISIS. Turkey considers this group, the YPG, to be an existential threat to their country because they are linked to Kurdish separatists inside Turkey who commit attacks. Many other NATO members see this group as an ally against terrorism. This is French President Emmanuel Macron.
When I look at Turkey, they now are fighting against those who fight with us, who fought with us, shoulder to shoulder against ISIS. And sometimes they work with ISIS proxies. This is an issue, and this is a strategic issue.
Okay, we've got NPR's Peter Kenyon on the line from Istanbul. Good morning, Peter. Can you just tell us exactly what Turkey is threatening to do here?
Well, it's saying it will block a defense plan for the Baltics, which it has no real objection to, unless NATO acknowledges Turkey's fight against Kurdish militiamen in Syria. U.S. and European officials say Turkey should just drop the threat.
So why is this happening? I mean, we know that Erdogan has long considered this group of Kurdish fighters to be a real threat to its territorial sovereignty. Why is this happening now?
Well, Turkey's been fighting these other Kurdish militants, as we noted, the PKK, for more than 3 decades now. The U.S. and the EU are on board. PKK is a terrorist group, they say. But this Syrian group, the YPG, is a different case. Turkey says they're terrorists. The U.S. and EU say no, they've fought bravely against ISIS in Syria. Turkey attacked the YPG, remember, after President Trump moved U.S. forces out of the way in Syria. Soon that got Russia involved. They had to help move the YPG forces away from the border, trying to keep a ceasefire going. But what Erdogan wants now is for all of NATO to say, yep, Turkey's right, fighting the YPG is fighting terrorism, and he's finding that a very hard sell.
So he feels like he has leverage over this particular defense plan for the Baltics, threatening to veto it. But where else does Erdogan's leverage lie? I mean, what good is Turkey to NATO?
Well, any NATO member can hold one thing up because it takes everybody to say yes to get something done. But, I mean, Turkey's been a NATO member since 1952. It's got peacekeeping forces in Afghanistan. It's got NATO air bases. It's strategically located. There's plenty of reasons why it's in the alliance. It's taken in 3.6 million Syrians since 2011, sparing a huge burden to Europe and others. But it's also been problematic. It wants to move some of those Syrians back to their homeland, to this so-called safe zone. A potentially bigger problem is the purchase of Russian S-400 missiles. They're not compatible with NATO or U.S. weapons, and that may be why President Macron said Turkey has to decide, does it still want to be part of this NATO alliance?
Where's the U.S. on this, in particular President Trump? I mean, he's been very accommodating to Erdogan in the past.
And continued to be, praising him as very helpful in operations like the one against ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So there's clear differences, and it will be very interesting to see if any progress is made at this NATO summit.
NPR's Peter Kenyon from Istanbul. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Rachel.
All right, now to a story affecting hundreds of thousands of student loan borrowers, people with disabilities who are entitled to have their debts erased, but also missed out on getting that relief from the federal government.
So for more than half a century, this is how the system was supposed to work. If you have a significant permanent disability and can no longer work enough to support yourself, you can ask the U.S. Department of Education to forgive your debts. But an NPR investigation finds the vast majority of eligible borrowers are not getting the help that they deserve.
NPR's Corey Turner and Claire Lombardo worked on this story for months, and Corey is in the studio with us this morning. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
What did your investigation find?
Well, we're talking about people with the most severe kinds of disabilities. The Social Security category is called MINE, Medical Improvement Not Expected. And we should say back in 2016, the Ed Department actually did something really good. It ramped up efforts to find these eligible borrowers and let them know that they qualify to have their loans discharged.
Okay.
But we've found that even since then, just 28% of those borrowers have made it through this process or are even on track to. So we spoke with one borrower. His name is Drew Lehman. He's 48, a husband, father of two, and he suffered a devastating back injury when his car was rear-ended.
It was at a point where I couldn't, do anything. I was having trouble just getting up, walking. Basic things around the house were next to impossible.
And Lehman ultimately had to quit working full-time. He applied for disability, and he's now in the middle of trying to have his student loans discharged.
So why is that even a process, Corey? I mean, if the Department of Education knows who these borrowers are, they know that they're eligible to have these student loans erased, why isn't it just happening automatically?
Yeah, well, the reason used to be because borrowers could get hit with a big tax bill. But the 2017 tax overhaul changed all of that. Still, even after that tax change, borrowers are required to apply for the help. It's not automatic. The department does send them letters, but, these letters often go to the wrong place, or they go to the wrong person, or they don't get read, or they don't get understood. And this is important, even for borrowers who do apply and get approved to have their loans discharged, they still have to clear one more hurdle. It's a really complicated income monitoring process. And NPR has learned that 44,000 borrowers who went into this income monitoring over the past 3 years have been kicked out and have not successfully appealed. And I want to be clear, that's not because they're making too much money to qualify. Almost all of those people got kicked out simply because they didn't send in the right paperwork on time.
Just a bureaucratic mistake. So what's the Department of Education saying about this?
Well, a department official tells NPR that the department has made incremental improvements since 2016 and, quote, "We continue to look for ways to make the process easier to navigate for disabled student loan borrowers while maintaining the integrity of the taxpayers' dollars associated with the discharges," close quote. But, Rachel, this is really important. We also found in our investigation that earlier this year, the department told Congress it was discharging loans for 40% of borrowers. But it's not. We asked the department, show us how you got to 40%. And it couldn't. The truth, according to the data that we got, again, is closer to 28% of borrowers with disabilities getting the help they deserve.
All right, NPR's Corey Turner with the rest of our education team following this important story. Corey, thank you so much for bringing this investigation our way. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel.
So did President Trump's dealings with Ukraine rise to the level of an impeachable offense?
For 3 constitutional scholars who were called by Democrats to testify yesterday, the answer was clear.
If what we're talking about is not impeachable, then nothing is impeachable.
If you conclude that he asked for the investigation of Vice President Biden and his son for political reasons, that is to aid his reelection, then yes, you have bribery here.
Impeachment is complete when the president abuses his office, and he abuses his office by attempting to abuse his office.
A 4th witness, a legal expert called by Republicans, said the Democrats just hadn't met the burden of proof for impeachment.
This is much like the Johnson impeachment. It's manufactured until you build a record. I'm not saying you can't build a record, but you can't do it like this, and you can't impeach a president like this.
All right, let's bring in NPR senior political editor Domenico Montanaro, who was listening to it all yesterday. Hey, Domenico.
Hey, David.
So to learn anything new here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that aside from the fact that this was, a nice conversation about, legal framework around impeachment, we did get a window into what the Democrats might be thinking about articles of impeachment. 3 specifically that Democrats really mentioned. 1, abuse of power and bribery, which was lumped together. 2, obstruction of Congress. And 3, obstruction of justice, which was interesting because it included the obstruction allegations laid out in the Mueller-Russia investigation, which we haven't heard about in a while. Norm Eisen, who's a former ethics lawyer in the Obama White House, was the one asking questions for the Democrats, and he was clearly testing those out. He was trying to fill in how and why, as Democrats believe, Trump committed those things. Here's Harvard law professor Noah Feldman, who raised the stakes and, like many others yesterday, invoked a couple of the founding fathers.
We may meet there, Madison and Hamilton, and they will ask us, when the President of the United States acted to corrupt the structure of the Republic, what did you do?
And he was talking about, he said, whether we go to the good place or the other place.
Wow.
University of North Carolina professor Michael Gerhardt called what Trump did a horrifyingly obvious abuse of power. Jonathan Turley, who you guys mentioned in the intro, didn't see it that way, and that was plenty for Republicans. Here was Turley.
You need to stick the landing on the quid pro quo. You need to get the evidence to support it. It might be out there, I don't know, but it's not in this record.
And Turley, of course, the witness who was called by the Republicans. I mean, beyond having him testify, Domenico, does it look like Republicans are really digging in? I mean, are they getting more emboldened in their defense of President Trump?
Absolutely. They felt like they had a good day yesterday. And you could see that as the hearing went on. I mean, they were much more comfortable, much more confident that some GOP members became. Some were even defending Trump's phone call, which they hadn't done during the intelligence hearings very much. And the motivations of that call with the Ukrainian President Zelensky, not even Turley would say that that call was perfect, but GOP members yesterday were saying basically there's nothing to see here, and they were trying to muddy up the other professors called by Democrats.
So what happens now?
Well, later this morning, we're expecting to hear from the Democratic and Republican House leaders, Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy. We're waiting to see what judiciary winds up doing with those articles of impeachment. And, this all sets up the potential for a House floor vote on impeachment by Christmas with a Senate trial in January.
All right, NPR senior political editor Domenico Montanaro. Thanks so much, Domenico.
You're welcome.
Okay, so as for one key figure in all of this, the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, where is he exactly?
Well, he has reportedly surfaced in, of all places, Ukraine. Giuliani's trip comes as Ukraine's president tries to disentangle himself from the U.S. impeachment drama. This is President Volodymyr Zelensky talking last month about Burisma. That's the Ukrainian gas company where Joe Biden's son sat on the board.
I think everybody in Ukraine is so tired about Burisma. We have our country, we have our independence, we have our problems and questions.
For Zelensky, those problems include his own falling approval ratings.
All right, let's bring in NPR's Lucian Kim, who is in Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. Hi, Lucian.
Good morning.
Okay, so the impeachment saga continuing in the United States, House Judiciary Committee taking over could lead to articles of impeachment against President Trump. How are people in Ukraine reacting to all of this?
Well, I think there's a one-word answer to that question: exasperation. President Zelensky won a landslide last spring. That was based on Ukrainians' frustration with the 5-year conflict with Russia, with corruption, and with a lack of economic opportunity. And the one thing that Zelensky didn't expect was that Ukraine's friendship with the United States would be called into question. He really expected the U.S. to have Ukraine's back. Just yesterday at a press conference, he reiterated that he wants to focus on Ukraine's problems and priorities and stay out of the impeachment scandal. I asked a political commentator here in Kiev named Ivan Yakovina how we should understand Zelensky's position.
Zelensky has to keep up smiley face, although he understands perfectly well that Trump hates Ukraine and loves Russia. But still, he's as a responsible leader of his own country. He has to be nice with the United States because it's the biggest and the strongest country in the world, and he doesn't want to have any additional problems with America, so he doesn't want to irritate Trump, so he's trying to be nice. It's obvious.
In other words, Zelensky is in a much weaker position compared to the American president, so certainly he isn't going to do anything to rock the boat additionally.
Is it going so far as affecting his ability to govern or for his government to do its job?
Well, in that same press conference yesterday, Zelensky was asked that question, and he said, no, it doesn't affect our government. It affects the U.S. government a lot more. Zelensky right now is under enormous pressure to deliver on peace with Russia and on bread and butter economic issues. As you mentioned, polls show his approval ratings are already falling down from about 70% in the fall to just above 50% now. Next week, Zelensky has his first meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And going into it, Zelensky earlier was expecting a lot more backing from the U.S. I spoke to Ukraine's Minister for Euro-Atlantic Integration, which includes NATO. His name is Dmytro Kuleba. This is what he said about American support.
We particularly appreciate the support that Ukraine enjoys both among Democrats and Republicans. This is the most fundamental task for us, to make sure that the issue of Ukraine is something that unites parties, not divides them.
So there's a real worry here in Kiev. We'll now lose that bipartisan support in Congress.
Well, I got to ask you, Lucian, I mean, if Zelensky is trying to get away from this impeachment scandal and focus on stuff at home, it doesn't help probably that Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, shows up in the country. The New York Times is reporting this. But what do you know about what Giuliani's doing there?
Well, we know very little. In fact, no reporters here have been able to find him. One reporter said he checked all the cigar bars here in Kiev last night and didn't find him. So what the New York Times was reporting is that he was trying to get meetings with 2 former prosecutors here in Kiev, 2 former prosecutors who have largely been discredited here because of allegations they were involved in corruption. So again, from the point of view of the Ukrainian government, this visit is highly unwelcome because it again brings an American political scandal to Ukraine, where there's a new government very much trying to turn a new page.
NPR's Lucian Kim in Kiev. Thanks so much, Lucian.
Thank you.
All right, in France, people are bracing for a total shutdown today.
Right. Transport workers, teachers, hospital staff even are among the people walking off their jobs in protest. This general strike was called after French President Emmanuel Macron clashed with unions over plans to change the pension system. The broader context of all this are the so-called Yellow Vest uprisings, which have happened over the past year, that started over protests about a gas tax, then became this whole movement about economic struggle.
All right, NPR's Eleanor Beardsley is covering this story and joins us from the streets of Paris. Hi, Eleanor.
Hi, guys.
It's so interesting. We've been talking about President Macron at NATO, his dealings with President Trump at those meetings in London. It sounds like in France, this is the big story. I mean, this massive shutdown. What does Paris feel like today?
Absolutely. Well, you know what? I'm out at a major intersection next to a subway train station that's closed today. And it feels like a Sunday morning, not a Thursday morning, David. It's a shocker. I think that people were so worried, so bracing for chaos and paralysis that they stayed home. 80% of the trains and metros are not running today. And I was watching TV and they said usually on a normal day, there's 100 miles of traffic jams on the Beltway around Paris. Today, there were 15 miles of traffic jams. So it's completely like a weekend day. But actually, I think that's an ominous sign that people are hunkered down for the duration. This thing could last.
Oh, wow. What set this off in the first place? Remind us.
Well, what set it off is Macron's anticipated pension reform, because he hasn't even done it yet. He's just at the consultation stage with unions. But it's sort of like, a shot across the bow, a warning shot. Don't take away what we have, take us back. But you know what? I think more deeply, this is about deep anger against Macron in society. He has no political opposition, basically, David, in the parliament. But in society, there's deep anger. There are people who think he's ultra-capitalist, and he wants to create this society where everybody competes and struggles. There are others who saw all that police violence against the yellow vests, and they see an authoritarian, violent side. So I think it's much more a reflection of that.
Well, I just think about the empty streets you're describing. If people are hunkering down for this to be lengthy, I mean, how is life going to be affected?
Well, life's completely affected today. You see it, but we've been seeing all week, like, bicycle sales shops sold out of their bikes, and they never sell out of their bikes in December, you know? So everyone's turned to bikes today and scooters. People have taken the day off. They're telecommuting. I went to the metro last night just as the strike was beginning, and I met an EasyJet pilot, Stan Millet. He says he's on standby today, and he's not going to move from his house. Here's what he told me.
Oh, it's going to be a big mess. It's going to be a big mess because they are scheduled to cancel 80% of the traffic on the subway. 5 or 6 lines going to be just out of order. But we used to that. We used to that in France, so just casual December for us. He's making changes, and we don't really want changing in France, so we don't like that.
So the unions want this strike to go on and on for weeks to shut Macron and his reform down.
Wow. All right. Lots to follow in France. NPR's Eleanor Beardsley. Thanks so much, Eleanor.
You're welcome, David.
Nancy Pelosi said there is, quote, no choice but to act.
That's right. She called on the House to draft articles of impeachment against President Trump. This is what Pelosi told a CNN town hall last night.
This is a very sad day, I think, for our country. It's something that I would have hoped we could have avoided, but the president's actions made it necessary.
This means that President Trump is likely to become only the third sitting president in U.S. history to be impeached.
NPR congressional reporter Claudia Grisales is with us in studio. Hey, Claudia.
Hi, Noelle.
So articles of impeachment are coming. Do you know what they might look like?
Well, Democrats are strategizing over this very question right now. We're told some lawmakers were preparing to work through the weekend, and Speaker Pelosi has left the door open for how broad or narrow these articles could be. We've heard evidence uncovered of bribery, obstruction of Congress, and perhaps obstruction of justice. And that final article would be tied to the Mueller investigation. And that goes to the central question Democrats are facing right now, whether to focus on just the findings from the Ukraine investigation or expand that to include evidence from the Mueller probe.
Another question they're facing is how quickly or not they will be able to get this done. What does the timeline for impeachment look like?
Yes, House lawmakers are marching towards a deadline that many had hoped for. Their last scheduled day in session before the holiday recess is December 20th. Following Speaker Pelosi's directive yesterday, the House Judiciary Committee set a hearing on Monday to accept evidence in the probe that will be used to draw up the articles. And we could see those by the end of next week. And in the final week of the session, the week of the 16th, we could see the floor vote on these articles. That sets up January for a potential Senate trial, and already lawmakers there say the month is set aside for this.
Oh, wow. Okay, so they're expecting it. We heard Nancy Pelosi a couple minutes ago. We know where the Democrats stand. What are Republicans saying at this point?
Yes, they are remaining loyal to their defense of the president, saying he did nothing wrong. NPR's All Things Considered co-host Mary Louise Kelly spoke with Republican Congressman Doug Collins yesterday. He's the ranking member for the House Judiciary Committee, and here's what he told her.
Let's get this out of the way. He did nothing wrong. The call did not show anything wrong. The facts have done that.
Collins also said that he thinks the president should defend himself in the process when the time is right, and says House Democrats are presuming guilt and forcing the president to prove his innocence.
Interesting that he said he thinks the president should defend himself, because that's been one of the big questions as we move through this is will President Trump testify? What has President Trump said he expects from a Senate trial?
Well, President Trump is looking for redemption in a Senate trial. Over several weeks, he and other White House officials have been meeting with Senate Republicans, plotting out a potential plan there. He says he wants to put on a strong defense with a long list of witnesses, the Bidens, the whistleblower at the center of the House inquiry, House Intelligence Chairman Adam Schiff, and even Speaker Pelosi. But whether you can get a majority of the Senate to agree to that remains a tall order. There seems to be little appetite for such a plan, even among a simple simple majority of Republicans. I talked to one key Trump ally, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, and he has warned that a long list of witnesses could let a trial drag on. Let's take a listen.
If the participants in the trial want it extended, that's a good way to do it.
What is your take on that?
My take is let them decide how to defend themselves. It's not my job. It's theirs.
So it's a hint that despite the president's anxiousness to get to this trial phase, that plan could face its own set of obstacles.
NPR's Claudia Grisales. Claudia, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Measles is one of the most contagious human viruses in the world, but for years it was nearly wiped out.
It was nearly wiped out, but for some reason, the virus is now coming back. The World Health Organization says in a new report that nearly 140,000 people died from measles worldwide last year. There were measles outbreaks on every continent that year. This year's numbers appear to be even higher. All of this appears to be happening despite a safe and effective vaccine that has been used for decades. So the question is, why are we backsliding?
NPR's Jason Beaubien has been looking into what's going on. Hey, Jason.
Hey, good morning.
So I will admit, before these numbers came out, I did not even think about measles as a major public health concern anymore. I mean, I got the vaccine when I was a kid, so did basically everyone I know.
Yeah, I mean, measles is this story of incredible progress against the disease. I mean, in the pre-vaccine era, it was killing like 1 million people a year.
Wow.
And sort of in the 1980s, it was way up there, and it was just steadily going down. And this was one of these diseases that looked like, the trend line was just going to go straight down and it's going to get wiped out. But then it just sort of bottomed out on that progress in 2016. And this year, things are worse. It was below 100,000 deaths a year in 2016. Now it's up to 140. Malaria, which we don't have a decent vaccine for and is a major problem, is killing 400,000. So seeing measles push back up towards that, it's really concerning. It's a big deal.
Do we know why this is happening? As we've both said, there is a vaccine.
Right. There is a very effective vaccine. It's been around for 50 years. The issue is that measles as a virus is a super spreader. If you're not vaccinated, this will get you. If it's out there, it'll spread to you. I talked to Robert Linkins. He's the head of vaccine preventable diseases over at the CDC. And he says that this resurgence of measles is showing that there are these problems in basic healthcare delivery systems globally.
Measles is the canary in the coal mine. It indicates that there are problems in the community with other vaccine preventable disease coverage, and in many respects, it's a signal that we've got to pay more attention to where measles is occurring.
There's two issues. One is that just simply delivering it in some parts of the world, sort of infrastructure problems is part of it. And then there's these anti-vaccination movements that have really cut into the progress against measles.
Where are the anti-vaccination people? Where are they coming from?
Well, it really is different in different places. I mean, some of it is a growing skepticism about anything related to the government, and that's part of it. And that's going on some, in social media. Then you've had some scandals in different parts of the world. In Samoa, we've got a big outbreak going on right at the moment. They've shut down the schools. There was 2 children who died after a vaccine was improperly mixed. So that really cuts into people's confidence. But overall, this is a very effective vaccine. It's something that can be dealt with, and unfortunately, we're moving in the wrong direction right now.
NPR's Jason Beaubien. Jason, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, before we get into this next story, we have a warning. We're going to be talking about sexual assault, and if you're listening with your kids, it might be better to listen later on.
That's right. Okay, so for years, both passengers and drivers have been complaining to Uber that they've been sexually assaulted during an Uber ride. We would hear anecdotal stories. Now, for the first time, the ride-sharing company is revealing the scale of those complaints in the United States. And just before we go on, we do want to note here that Uber is one of NPR's financial supporters.
NPR's tech correspondent Shannon Bond has been following all the issues with us in the studio. Hi, Shannon.
Hi, Noelle.
So the numbers here are horrifying.
Yeah, they're really shocking. The company received 5,981 allegations of sexual assault in the U.S. over 2 years in 2017 and 2018. Now, most of those claims were about unwanted touching of the mouth, breasts, buttocks, genitals. More troubling, there were 235 reports of rape last year alone. That's more than 4 a week.
Wow.
right? And in all of these claims of sexual assault, the victims aren't just passengers, they're also drivers. Passengers were actually accused of sexual assault in nearly half of the reports. But at the same time, this is also a company that operates at a huge scale. People in the U.S. took 2.3 billion rides using Uber in those 2 years. So that means that actually for more than 99.9% of the rides, there were no safety problems.
Why, Shannon, did Uber come out and voluntarily release this data? It reflects negatively on the company to some extent.
Yeah, it does. Uber says it's releasing this data to be more accountable. I spoke with Tony West. He's Uber's top lawyer.
People have a right to know. And we know that it's very important if we're going to consistently and continually raise the bar on safety, we have to be willing to share this information with the public.
So ride-hailing apps have been dealing with complaints and lawsuits from victims of sexual assault for years. And it's not just Uber. It's competitors around the world, Lyft here in the U.S., Didi in China, Ola in India. And there have been some really terrible cases. I mean, in China, there were these 2 cases of women being killed by their Didi drivers, and one of them was also raped. Uber has settled lawsuits with victims here in the U.S. It was also in a really egregious case. It was sued by a woman in India who was raped by her driver. She then accused Uber executives of obtaining her medical records in an attempt to discredit her. So they have a really spotty history on this.
Can you draw any kind of comparison between Uber and regular taxi cabs? Like, is this a problem with ride-sharing companies?
Right. So that was the first question I had when looking at all of these numbers. And there's really no good answer to that question. There aren't national statistics about sexual assaults and sexual violence in U.S. taxis each year, or even other forms of transportation. Taxis are typically regulated by individual cities. They may collect some data, but that's kind of inconsistent. It doesn't really match the Uber data. And it's also important to understand that when we're looking at these numbers from Uber, this is not a complete picture. It includes the 5 most serious categories of sexual assault, like rape and unwanted touching, but not other types of misconduct, like masturbation.
Just quickly, what is Uber saying it's going to do about this?
Well, they've added safety features already, and they say they want to add more, like recording rides with audio or video. They want to start sharing the names of drivers who have been banned for serious safety violations with other ride-hailing companies. That would prevent them from just switching over. But that raises some really serious questions about privacy and fairness as well, that they're going to have to balance against safety.
NPR's Shannon Bond. Shannon, thanks so much.
Thanks.